Chapter 2, Seeking Balance. How much do you think about your heart? Since before you were even born, that miraculous machine has been steadily pumping the energy of life throughout your body, day in, day out. At least 115,000 beats each day, with the sole purpose of keeping you alive. But beyond the complex physical task of delivering essential nutrients to every cell, tissue, and organ, your heart's pulse also regulates your emotional energy. A strong, even pace can bring a sense of calm. A rapid staccato can panic even the healthiest person. There was a time in my late 40s when I noticed a change, a rapid fluttering in my own heart. I immediately started thinking, worst-case scenario. One night, I awoke with my heart beating so intensely, I thought for the first time in my life that I was about to die. It took 6 months before I understood what was happening. A book I found lying on a table outside the studio where we taped the Oprah Winfrey Show noted that heart palpitations can be part of menopause. A doctor confirmed that this was true and that my body was indeed undergoing menopausal changes. I can't tell you how relieved I felt. Relieved and awed, because for me, those direct messages from my heart were one of the most powerful connections I'd ever made with my unique biosystem. They were proof of what I already believed, that my body is always speaking to me. The same is true for you. From birth, your heart is constantly sending messages about the state of your well-being. It's intimately attuned to the slightest shifts in your physical and emotional health. And when it sends out a warning, every part of you feels the effect. Ever since those episodes with my heart, I've felt deep gratitude for this ever-vigilant internal alarm. In times of stress, its changes in cadence have been a gift. But as I've learned from Dr. Perry, remaining in a constant state of high alert can have devastating effects on your overall physical and emotional health. The correlation between long-term stress and conditions like anxiety, depression, stroke, heart disease, and diabetes is real. I was in my 20s when I was first challenged in a big way to regulate my own stress. I'd taken a job as a reporter and was working 100-hour weeks. I wanted to be a team player, but I could feel myself becoming increasingly out of sync. As I explained earlier, traumatic events in my childhood, including an uprooted family, sexual abuse, and regular beatings, had conditioned me to be a skilled people pleaser, even if it meant completely depleting my own energy. And so, when I felt the stress indicators that my body was sending, I ignored them, choosing instead to soothe myself with the drug that was most easily accessible: food. The more out of rhythm my life became, the more I sought relief to silence the signals. I was tuned in enough to know that I was betraying myself. I knew that I had only a certain amount of energy, and I knew that it needed to be conserved and restored. But it would take decades for me to understand how to live with my own rhythms. Now, when I begin to feel overwhelmed, I pull back. I've learned to say no. When I'm around someone who drains me, I put up a barrier, a non-physical wall that keeps that person's negative energy at bay. I've also created a sacred personal space, blocking out Sundays as a time of renewal, allowing myself to be with myself, allowing myself simply to be. When this time is interrupted or threatened by someone who invades my state of calm, I become irritable, anxiety-prone, and distressed about making decisions, not the person I want to be in the world. The quickest and most consistent way for me to get back to my own rhythm is to walk in nature, just focusing on my breath, my steady heartbeat, the stillness of a tree, or the intricacy of a leaf can center me in the wholeness of all things. Music, laughter, dancing, even a party for one, cooking, knitting, finding what naturally soothes you not only regulates your heart and mind, it helps you stay open to the goodness in you and in the world. Oprah. I remember walking on the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls campus with you, watching the girls dance, sing, and laugh together as they moved from one class to the next. You'd been working with the students there for over 10 years, and as we looked on, you said something like, "That will help them learn." We ended up talking about why rhythm is so important.
Absolutely. Rhythm is essential to a healthy body and a healthy mind. Every person in the world can probably think of something rhythmic that makes them feel better. Walking, swimming, music, dance, the sound of waves breaking on a beach.
It's why we rock babies when they cry. We're trying to help them find their own rhythm to help calm them down.
Exactly. And that will help us calm down as well. The emotions of people around us are contagious. When our baby's upset, it can make us upset. So we go to the baby and hold her and walk with her. We start with a rhythm that is soothing to us. And if that doesn't work, we slowly shift to a pattern that is regulating for the baby. The baby's response to our efforts shapes the style of the rhythmic soothing we use. As we grow up, we find our own set of regulating rhythms and activities. For some of us, it is walking. For others, it's doing needlework or riding a bike. Everyone has their go-to options when they feel out of sync, anxious, or frustrated. The common element is rhythm. Rhythm is regulating.
People use the word wellness to mean overall health or balance among mind, body, spirit, but you talk about regulation a lot. Help me understand, what do you mean by that?
Well, regulation is also about being in balance. We have many different systems that are continuously monitoring our body and the outside world to make sure we're safe and in balance, that we have enough food, water, oxygen. When we're regulated, these systems have what they need. Stress is what occurs when a demand or challenge takes us out of balance, away from our regulated set points. When we get out of balance, we become dysregulated and feel discomfort or distress. When we get back into balance, we feel better. Relief of distress, getting back into balance, activates the reward networks in the brain. We feel pleasure when we get back into balance, from cold to warm, thirsty to quenched, hungry to satiated.
And regulation is more than a biological concept. In all areas of our lives, we're seeking what we need to be stabilized, balanced, and regulated.
Exactly. Balance is the core of health. We feel and function best when our body's systems are in balance, and when we're in balance with friends, family, community, and nature.
And what's really important for parents to realize is what you just said, that learning healthy self-regulation actually begins in infancy. When babies cry, they're either hungry or thirsty or tired, or their diaper needs changing, or they need to be touched. And since they can't feed themselves or change their own diaper, crying is their way to get themselves back into balance, to get their caregiver to do what has to be done in order for them to get back into balance. The problem is, when their caregiver doesn't respond, rather than being put back in balance, regulated, the baby will get more upset.
Absolutely. If I get hungry, I get up and make myself a sandwich. I self-regulate. But as you said, the infant has to rely on adults to help her with this. Caregiving adults provide external regulation. Over time, these responsive adults help the child's brain begin to build self-regulating capabilities. As we've mentioned, one of the most powerful tools we use to help regulate a distressed infant is rhythm.
Why is that?
Well, all life is rhythmic. The rhythms of the natural world are embedded in our biological systems. This begins in the womb, when the mother's beating heart creates rhythmic sound, pressure, and vibrations that are sensed by the developing fetus and provide constant rhythmic input to the organizing brain. These experiences create powerful associations, essentially memories, that connect rhythms of roughly 60 to 80 beats per minute to regulation. 60 to 80 BPM is the average resting heart rate for an adult. It's the rhythm the fetus sensed, and it equates to being in balance, to being warm, full, quenched, safe. After birth, rhythms at these frequencies can comfort and soothe, whereas the loss of rhythm or high variable and unpredictable patterns of sensory input become associated with threat. When we rock the distressed baby, the rhythmic movement activates this memory of safety. The infant feels more in balance and calms down. Furthermore, by rocking the baby while also feeding, warming, and loving them, the caring adults strengthen the primary associations between rhythm and regulation. These loving interactions begin to expand the complex memory of regulation by mixing in human contact. The caregiver's smell, touch, smile, and voice also become connected with regulation, with safety. The roots of health are rhythm and regulation. When you mix in attentive, responsive, and nurturing caregiving, the roots and trunk of our brain's tree of regulation are being organized. Listeners can take a look at this tree structure in Figure 2 of the PDF.
So when you're raised in a nurturing, supportive, caring environment and you cry and someone responds to your needs, you're being regulated. Ultimately, as you grow up with this loving attention, what you describe as the tree of regulation grows, and these networks in your brain allow you to regulate yourself and connect to people in healthy relationships.
Exactly. And this is so important that it's worth a closer look. First, as we've been discussing, we have important neural networks involved in regulation, including our stress response systems. Second, we have neural networks that are involved in forming and maintaining relationships. Finally, we have neural networks that are involved in reward. When these are activated, they give us pleasure. When these three systems begin to wire together, they create our foundational memories. These are the reason that we feel regulated and rewarded when we get signals of acceptance or warmth from another person. A person's capacity to connect, to be regulating and regulated, to reward and be rewarded, is the glue that keeps families and communities together.
Regulation, relationship, and reward.
Exactly. When the attentive and responsive adult comes to the crying infant, two very important things happen. The baby feels the pleasure of being regulated after being distressed, and also experiences the sight, smell, touch, sound, and movement of human interaction. The loving sensations provided by the adult caregiver start to become associated with pleasure. In thousands of moments, when the caregiver responds to the needs of the infant, the brain is connecting relationship to reward and regulation. And so, when you are an attentive, attuned, and responsive caregiver to these little ones, you're literally weaving together this powerful three-part association. You're building a healthy root system for the tree of regulation. Furthermore, as we talked about earlier, these bonding experiences create the infant's worldview about humans. A consistent, nurturing caregiver builds an internal view that people are safe, predictable, and caring.
The humans coming to regulate me are not bad. When I need something, it'll work out. People are safe and supportive.
Yes, and that's a remarkable and powerful worldview. We learn that a connection with another person can be rewarding and regulating. It pulls us to engage with our teachers, coaches, classmates. It usually leads to more and more positive human interactions that add to our internal catalog of experience. The brain is a meaning-making machine, always trying to make sense of the world. If our view of the world is that people are good, then we will anticipate good things from people. We project that expectation in our interactions with others, and thereby actually elicit good from them. Our internal view of the world becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We project what we expect, and that helps elicit what we expect. Many years ago, I was at Chicago's O'Hare Airport in the winter on my way to an academic conference. It was snowing and all the flights were delayed. The gate area was filled with frustrated people, including an older gentleman sitting next to me. He was wearing a very expensive suit and a Rolex watch, and his frustration was clear. Each time the gate agent announced a further delay, he would mutter with fury and angrily snap his newspaper before reading some more. I watched a tired-looking young couple take turns following their daughter, a toddler, as she explored around the gate. For hours, as the stranded passengers grew more and more irritated, the toddler kept smiling, exploring, and touching everything she saw. At one point, when the gate agent came out and announced another delay, the man next to me burst from his seat, almost ran to the agent, and loudly demanded to see her supervisor. "I'm a gold medallion traveler, and I know people on the board. I'm due in Cleveland for a very important meeting." The whole gate fell silent as his rant continued. The poor gate agent simply looked out the window, pointed to the heavy snow falling, and said, "I'm sorry, sir, we are doing our best, but we can't control the weather." The man huffed back to his seat. Now, in my working model of the world, rude, entitled men treating people poorly are jerks. But when I glanced over at the little girl, her head was cocked as if she were trying to figure out why everyone had gotten quiet when this man talked. Her working model of the world was that people are good. So whatever else this man might be, he was good too. She walked right over and stood before him. She put her sticky little hands on his knees and smiled. He frowned and snapped his paper up to read right in front of her face. My worldview was reinforced. He's even mean to little children? Super jerk. The little girl paused. Then, clearly thinking that this was a game, because people are good, right? She smiled and ripped the paper down, beaming at who she thought would be her new playmate. Oh man, I thought, this is bad. But I was wrong, and she was right. She smiled her big smile, and shaking his head in defeat, he smiled back. Her goodness projected was contagious. She drew the best from this man, and her worldview was reinforced. For the next 30 minutes, the two of them played together as her parents looked on. He even got down on his hands and knees, expensive suit be damned, to give her a horsey ride around the dirty, crowded gate. She elicited what she projected, thanks to an internalized view of the world that came from thousands of loving moments when her parents, family, and caregivers were present, attentive, and responsive in loving ways.
But what happens when a baby doesn't get those positive, nurturing responses? Say, if a mom is on her own with no help or depressed or in a violent relationship, she may really want to be a loving, responsive parent, but is that possible under those circumstances?
This is one of the central problems in our society. We have too many parents caring for children with inadequate supports. The result is what you'd expect. An overwhelmed, exhausted, dysregulated parent will have a hard time regulating a child consistently and predictably. This can impact the child in two really important ways. First, it affects the development of the child's stress response systems. If the hungry, cold, scared infant is inconsistently responded to and regulated by the overwhelmed caregiver, this creates an inconsistent, prolonged, and unpredictable activation of the child's stress response systems. I've illustrated this in Figure 3, which you can see in the PDF with this audiobook. The result is a sensitization of these important systems. In prolonged cases of trauma, the core regulatory networks of the tree of regulation change and adapt so they can better cope with the current challenge. The system works hard to keep you in balance, but it can be difficult and exhausting. And in these long-term cases, even when the challenge passes, the change in these systems persists. The hypervigilance of a boy living with domestic violence scanning his home for any sign of threat is very adaptive. In a classroom, this can prevent the child from paying attention to the teacher and result in the child being labeled with attention deficit disorder, which is maladaptive. The second major problem has to do with that process of creating connections about relationships. If, while the infant is creating her working model of the world, the caregiver responds in unpredictable ways, or is episodically rough, frustrated, cold, or absent, the child begins to create a different sort of worldview. We had a project working with a preschool where we were observing student-teacher interactions. In one of the classrooms, there was a young, enthusiastic, and very nurturing teacher. At the beginning of the year, this teacher warmly greeted each child, gave them a hug and a big smile. All during the day, this teacher interacted with the children in very attentive ways. We noticed that one little girl avoided this teacher's physical affection and never made eye contact. When the teacher hugged her, she simply stood still and didn't reciprocate. Eventually, we learned that this child had a very overwhelmed, depressed mother, and that no other adults were in the household. As time went by, the teacher continued to be warm and effusive with the other children, but week by week, the positive overtures to this withdrawn, sad girl decreased. You can imagine that this girl's worldview was, I'm not that important. You can't really trust people. About a month into the school year, the class was doing an activity when the little girl raised her hand for help. It was the first time she'd ever reached out that way. She held her hand high, waved it, but the teacher was fully engaged with a group of children at another table and didn't notice. The teacher was laughing and smiling with the other children. The little girl watched for a few moments, then slowly lowered her hand. For the rest of the year, she never asked for help again. After the project was over, we showed the video clip to the teacher, who started to cry. She felt terrible guilt. There was no intention to ignore this girl, but we all require some reciprocal social feedback to stay engaged. The little girl's working model of the world, I don't matter, projected into the classroom and became a self-fulfilling prophecy. We elicit from the world what we project into the world, but what you project is based upon what happened to you as a child.
So, because this little girl may not have had her basic needs met early in her life because her mother was overwhelmed, alone, exhausted, depressed, and therefore unable to be present, attentive, attuned, and responsive, as you say, the child is out of balance. And if this pattern of care develops into outright neglect, where the fundamental needs are ignored for longer and longer periods of time, or those cries for help go unmet or are responded to with anger or punishment, the child is living with constant distress. In either situation, she is out of balance.
Absolutely. And probably the most important aspect of this is the pattern of stress activation. If the parent is consistent, predictable, and nurturing, the stress response systems become resilient. If the stress response systems are activated in prolonged ways or chaotic ways, as in the cases of abuse or neglect, they become sensitized and dysfunctional. Though we're generally not aware of it, we are continually sensing and processing information from the outside world. Based upon this input, our brain and body respond in ways that help keep us connected, alive, and thriving. When we are pushed out of equilibrium, out of balance, we have a set of stress response systems that will be activated to help us. Most people are familiar with the term fight or flight. This refers to a set of responses that can kick in when we are afraid. Your brain will focus your attention on the potential threat, shutting down unnecessary mental processes, like reflecting on the meaning of life or daydreaming about an upcoming vacation. Your sense of time collapses to the moment. Your heart rate goes up, sending blood to your muscles in preparation, potentially, for fleeing or fighting. Adrenaline pumps through your body. This response is activating your body. As we'll talk more about later, this arousal response is not the only way we can respond to a threat. Imagine a situation where you're too small to win a fight and unable to run away. In this case, the brain and the rest of the body prepare for injury. Your heart rate goes down. You release your body's own painkiller, opioids. You disengage from the external world and psychologically flee to your inner world. Time seems to slow. You may feel like you're in a movie or floating and watching things happen to you. This is all part of another adaptive capability called dissociation. For babies and very young children, dissociation is a very common adaptive strategy. Fighting or fleeing won't protect you, but disappearing might. You learn to escape into your inner world. You dissociate. And over time, your capacity to retreat to that inner world, safe, free, in control, increases. A key part of that sensitized ability to dissociate is to be a people pleaser. You comply with what others want. You find yourself doing things to avoid conflict, to ensure that the other person in the interaction is pleased, as well as gravitating towards various regulating but dissociative activities. Finding balance can be an exhausting challenge for anyone with trauma-altered stress response systems. The search to avoid the pain of distress can lead to extreme, ultimately destructive methods of regulation.
One of the most raw conversations I've had about the struggle to find relief from emotional imbalance was with the British actor and comedian Russell Brand. At the time, he'd been sober for 11 years, but he'd recently published a powerful essay about how he continued to think about heroin nearly every day. "Drugs and alcohol are not my problem," he wrote. "Reality is my problem. Drugs and alcohol are my solution."
So how did you end up on drugs?
I was really, as a kid, I felt very unhappy and I felt sort of lonely and a bit sad. And I don't know if it's to do with my personal circumstances, single mum, and like feeling sort of like we didn't have like a lot of money and stuff. I felt sort of alienated and unhappy and lonely. But for me, I couldn't cope with being me. And when, like, first of all, I had problems with food. Like when I first discovered chocolate as a little kid, I used to eat it compulsively. Then I was infatuated with pornography. And then when I discovered drugs at 14...
So you have a very addictive personality.
Yeah, I look to solve inner problems with external things. I'll use anything to stop myself feeling. And as a little kid, I felt very lonely, very sort of isolated and confused. And anything that could temporarily relieve that, I was very grateful for.
But now you are obviously very self-aware. That is an amazingly profound thing you just said, that I look to fill my inner void, literally, with external things. When did you become aware of that?
When I've got clean, I realised that the reason that I was taking drugs was to deal with those emotional issues. And when you take drugs out of the equation, those issues remain.
On the 16th anniversary of his sobriety, Russell went on social media to credit his inpatient recovery treatment, support groups, and mentors. He said, "I have freedom now, and you can have freedom too." The spiritual teacher Gary Zukav has said, "When you find an addiction, do not be ashamed, be joyful. You have found something that you have come to this earth to heal. When you confront and heal an addiction, you are doing the deepest spiritual work that you can do on this earth." All this is by way of saying that we've known for years that there's a correlation between drug addiction and trauma, but the death toll just keeps rising. Dr. Perry, through your work with trauma victims, you found that most people are not taking drugs for the reasons that we think. It's not about self-indulgence and pleasure-seeking, or even a method to escape life in general, as much as it is about avoiding the pain and distress of dysregulation. True?
Absolutely. So often when we ask what happened, we find a history of developmental trauma. Most people with developmental adversity are chronically dysregulated. They tend to be wound up, anxious. Sometimes they feel like they're jumping out of their skin, or, as Russell Brand described it so well, the internal storm. As we will talk about more in a bit, their core regulatory networks are sensitized. If you grow up in a household or community characterized by unpredictability, chaos, and ongoing threat, you will very likely end up with an altered stress response system. This is especially true if the abuse, chaos, or exposure to violence took place in the home, and the very adults who were supposed to be nurturing and protecting you were the source of the pain, chaos, fear, or abuse. Remember what we said about the pattern of stress activation? Even in the absence of major traumatic events, unpredictable stress and the lack of control that goes with it are enough to make our stress response systems sensitized, overactive, and overly reactive, creating the internal storm. And also remember that humans are emotionally contagious. We sense the distress of others. Imagine a child in a home with a frustrated, angry father who has no job prospects, is disrespected in the community due to his status or skin color, and comes home feeling impotent, defeated. This parent's internal storm becomes the home's storm. His chaos becomes the home's chaos. He may use alcohol or a drug to manage his distress. But a drug-using parent, a drunk, overwhelmed, frustrated parent, is going to create a climate of fear for their children. As much as they may want to protect the children from their distress, and as much as they love their children, the mess is made. The children grow up internalizing this. They are incubated in terror. And as these children get older and are introduced to drugs or alcohol themselves, they may discover that they can feel a quiet they have never experienced. The pleasure that comes from the relief of distress becomes a powerful reward. Remember, relief of distress gives pleasure. They are relaxed for the first time in their lives. The pull to go back and use again is very powerful, though it's affected by how dysregulated you are and by the nature and strength of the other sources of reward in your life. Every day we fill our reward bucket with various sources of reward, and not every day is the same. Figure 4 in the PDF will give you a great comparison of how this looks. Some days will be rich with friends and family. Other days you may fill your reward bucket by volunteering at a local food kitchen. And some days we are left empty, unfulfilled. Many of us found it harder to fill up during the COVID-19 pandemic. People reported more anxiety and depression, and many people used some of the less healthy forms of reward to fill that void. The challenge with activating our reward circuits is that the pleasure fades. The feeling of reward is short-lived. Think how long the pleasure of eating a potato chip lasts. A few seconds. Then you want another. Same with a hit of nicotine from a cigarette, or even the smile of a loved one. It feels so good in the moment, and we can recall it and get a little pleasure, but the intense sense of reward fades. So each day we are pulled to refill our reward bucket. The healthiest way to do this is through relationships. Connectedness regulates and rewards us. Yet when substance abuse is involved, it can push loved ones away. And many interventions used to deal with substance abuse are punitive and increase distress. The pull to use gets stronger. Disconnection, marginalization, demonizing, and punishing only makes the problems of substance abuse worse. The cycle of dysregulation, self-medication, relational disruption, lack of reward leads to more substance abuse. And the spiral continues. But here's what's interesting about drug use. For people who are pretty well regulated, whose basic needs have been met, who have other healthy forms of reward, taking a drug will have some impact, but the pull to come back and use again and again is not as powerful. It may be a pleasurable feeling, but you're not necessarily going to become addicted. Addiction is complex, but I believe that many people who struggle with drug and alcohol abuse are actually trying to self-medicate due to their developmental histories of adversity and trauma.
It's interesting to hear you say that because I know lots of people who take drugs for their anxiety, whereas I have found medications like that just put me to sleep because my internal baseline is already so calm that when I take something that's supposed to just relax me, I doze off.
Right. You probably have friends who take the same amount that puts you to sleep.
In some cases, they're taking twice as much, and I'm thinking, how is everybody not just asleep? But if your baseline stress response is already elevated, you need more anxiety medication to get below your base. So even though people may not appear to be in a state of high alert or anxiety, they are biologically revved up.
Absolutely. And the drug soothes that. But when it comes to finding solutions to substance abuse and freedom from it, we will never truly solve the problems until we begin to focus on what happened to them.
Yes, what happened to you? Always the question to ask first.
Exactly. This is why a developmentally informed, trauma-aware perspective is so important for all of our systems impacted by or dealing with substance use and dependence. Education, mental health, law enforcement, juvenile and criminal justice, family courts. It's impossible to find any part of our society where this is not an issue. We have such good intentions, and we have good people, and we're spending a lot of money, but we're ineffective because we're not understanding the underlying mechanisms that make someone vulnerable to chronic substance use.
We need to understand that victims of trauma are more prone to all forms of addiction because their baseline of stress is different.
Exactly. It comes back to dysregulation. There's always a pull to regulate, to seek comfort, to fill that reward bucket. But it turns out that the most powerful form of reward is relational. Positive interactions with people are rewarding and regulating. Without connection to people who care for you, spend time with you, and support you, it is almost impossible to step away from any form of unhealthy reward and regulation. This includes alcohol overuse, drug overuse, eating too much sweet and salty food, porn, cutting, or spending hours and hours on video games. Connectedness counters the pull of addictive behaviors. It is the key. Chapter 3. How We Were Loved. I sat in the darkened room watching the mother Gloria and her 3-year-old daughter Tilly through a one-way mirror. They were doing great together. Gloria was tracking with Tilly's cues, much more in sync than in previous visits. Both appeared more comfortable with each other. Over the 2 years I had been watching their visits together, there had been so much positive change. On my left was Tilly's new Child Protective Services caseworker, her 5th over the last 2 years. On my right was Mama P, the child's foster mother. I'd known Mama P for years. She was a loving woman with an endless reserve of positive energy. She had fostered dozens of children. Each was special to her, each loved. Mama P probably taught me more about trauma and healing than anyone. Gloria had been removed from her family when she was 6. She struggled as she grew up in the child protective system, bouncing from foster home to foster home, school to school, community to community. Gloria had multiple complex social, emotional, and physical health problems related to her many traumatic experiences. Unfortunately, she'd been misunderstood by everyone: her therapists, foster caretakers, caseworkers, judges, teachers. 20 years ago, awareness of the impact of trauma wasn't very high. By age 18, when Gloria aged out of the system, she was using a variety of drugs to self-medicate her pain. On her 19th birthday, she was 8 months pregnant and homeless. By her 20th, she had an infant daughter. No support, no family, no work. Ultimately, the Child Protective System removed Tilly. Fortunately, Tilly was sent straight to Mama P. Over the next 2 years, Mama P helped both Gloria and Tilly. She was attentive and nurturing, creating a safe and stable home for Tilly. And she invited Gloria to be present and involved in Tilly's life as long as she wasn't using or drinking. Mama P realized that Gloria needed as much safe and stable nurturing as Tilly. She realized that Gloria was a young, unloved child in a woman's body. In the beginning, Gloria didn't engage much, but after 9 months or so, she accepted our offer to get clinical help for her trauma-related problems. By now, both Tilly and Gloria had grown up significantly. It was getting close to the time when Gloria would be able to care for Tilly on her own. But for that to happen, CPS had to make that recommendation to the court. This observed visit was part of the CPS reunification plan. We three sat silently watching Tilly and Gloria. After about 10 minutes of play, Gloria reached into her coat pocket and pulled out some candy. I could feel the CPS caseworker stiffen. She's not supposed to bring candy to these sessions. On my other side, I could feel Mama P making herself bigger in response to the caseworker's words. I quietly put my hand on Mama P's, trying to reassure her. She was very protective of both Gloria and Tilly. Tilly was pre-diabetic. In the first year of treatment, we'd noticed that Gloria, with so few relational tools, used candy to make Tilly happy. We came to understand that this was the primary way in which Gloria's foster caregivers had managed her when she was young. Getting candy was the closest Gloria got to being loved. Our brains develop as a reflection of the world we grow up with. You love others the way you've been loved. Gloria was merely showing love to her daughter the best way she knew. The caseworker continued, "She knows that she is not supposed to do that. This child is pre-diabetic. This is abusive." "No," I said, "it's sugar-free candy." Clearly this caseworker, new to Tilly, and likely dealing with 60 other cases, had not read the most recent reports. "How do you know that?" "I gave them to her before the session." I could feel Mama smiling. A year earlier, in a team meeting where we were trying to figure out the best way to balance Tilly's pre-diabetic condition with Gloria's impulse to use candy to show love, one of my clinical team members wanted to admonish Gloria. He suggested searching her before visits and prohibiting contact if she snuck candy to Tilly. Mama P disagreed. "That poor mother is doing the best she can. Let her give her daughter some candy. That is all she knows. You will not make her a better parent by punishing or shaming her. If we want her to be a more loving parent, we need to be more loving to her." So instead of admonishing Gloria, we simply had her switch to sugar-free candy and taught her about nutrition and diabetes. And of course, Mama P made sure that Gloria and Tilly both got lots of love. We explained this to the new caseworker, and together we created a transitional plan for reunification with lots of support for both Gloria and Tilly. Gloria got her GED and went to a community college to study nursing. Mama P stayed active in their little family. Rather than undermine a mother doing the best she could, we kept showing Gloria and Tilly love and how to love. One of the most remarkable properties of our brain is its capacity to change and adapt to our individual world. Neurons and neural networks actually make physical changes when stimulated. This is called neuroplasticity. The way they become stimulated is through our particular experiences. The brain changes in a use-dependent way. The neural networks involved in piano playing, for example, will make changes when activated by a child practicing her piano. These experience-dependent changes translate into better piano playing. This aspect of neuroplasticity, repetition leads to change, is well known and is why practice in sports, arts, and academics can lead to improvement. A key principle of neuroplasticity is specificity. In order to change any part of the brain, that specific part of the brain must be activated. If you want to learn to play the piano, you can't simply read about piano playing or watch and listen to YouTube clips of other people playing piano. You must put your hands on the keys and play. You have to stimulate the parts of the brain involved in piano playing in order to change them. This principle of specificity applies to all brain-mediated functions, including the capacity to love. If you have never been loved, the neural networks that allow humans to love will be undeveloped, as in Gloria's case. The good news is that with use, with practice, these capabilities can emerge. Given love, the unloved can become loving. Dr. Perry.
If I were to count the number of people I've interviewed, and believe me, I've tried, it would be over 50,000, one-on-one. And in nearly 40 years of conversations, beginning with my early years working in Nashville, through the Oprah Winfrey Show, and up to today, one common denominator has never changed. All of us want to know that what we do, what we say, and who we are matters. Like clockwork, whether it's the President of the United States, Beyoncé and all of her Beyoncé-ness, a mother sharing a painful secret, or a convicted criminal in search of forgiveness. At the end of any interview, the person sitting across from me in one form or another asks, "How did I do?" As they scan my face for a reaction, "Was I okay?" They always ask. The longing to be accepted and affirmed in their truth is the same for everyone, and beyond science, I know it boils down to this: how you were loved.
Yes, belonging and being loved are core to the human experience. We are a social species. We are meant to be in community, emotionally, socially, and physically interconnected with others. If you look at the fundamental organization and functioning of the human body, including the brain, you will see that so much of it is intended to help us create, maintain, and manage social interactions. We are relational creatures. And the capacity to be connected in meaningful and healthy ways is shaped by our earliest relationships. Love and loving caregiving is the foundation of our development. What happened to you as an infant has a profound impact on this capacity to love and be loved.
The word love gets thrown around a lot, but really the key is how you were given care, how your specific needs were met. I'm thinking of what we talked about earlier with regulation. The baby will be hungry or cold, out of balance, and when the baby cries, expressing need, the caregiver comes and regulates the child.
The caregiver coming to meet the needs of the infant is key. To the newborn, love is action. It is the attentive, responsive, nurturing care that adults provide. A parent may truly love his child, but if he's sitting at a computer posting on social media about how much he loves his child, while the infant is in another room awake, hungry, and crying, the infant experiences no love. To the infant, skin-to-skin warmth, the smell of the parent, the sights and sounds of her caregivers, the attentive and responsive caregiver's actions, that becomes love. The thousands of these loving, responsive interactions shape the developing brain of the infant. These loving moments literally build the foundation of the organizing brain. The pattern of stress activation created when the infant gets hungry, thirsty, or cold, and the caregiver meets their need and gets them back in balance, is the resilience-building pattern we talked about earlier. The moderately stressed infant cries. The cries bring the responsive, nurturing adult to regulate them, and because the adults are present, attentive, and responsive, their loving behaviors become predictable. When I feel hungry, I cry, and they come and feed me. The infant begins to associate these responsive people with pleasure, sustenance, warmth. Her view of the world is being shaped. Remember our little girl in the airport? People are good. It is through these interactions that the child's worldview is built, and depending upon the quality and pattern of the caregiver's responses, will build resilience or contribute to a sensitized, vulnerable child.
In every single interaction, there's a moment when we all wonder, do you see me? Do you hear me? Children know from birth whether their caregiver's eyes light up when they enter a room. They sense and respond to tenderness, playfulness, compassion, and patience, and they know the true feeling of quality time. They know they are loved.
And in turn, these caregiving interactions help build the infant's capacity to love. The attentive, loving behaviors grow the neural networks that allow us to feel love and then act in loving ways towards others. If you are loved, you learn to love. Caring for the infant in this loving way also changes the brain of the caregiving adult. These interactions regulate and reward both child and caregiver. The capacity to love is at the core of the success of humankind. The reason we've survived on this planet is that we've been able to form and maintain effective groups. Isolated and disconnected, we are vulnerable. In community, we can protect one another, cooperatively hunt and gather, share with the dependents of our family, our clan. Relational glue keeps our species alive, and love is relational superglue.
The way you treat a child from the time that child is born is what sets them to either succeed or struggle. What you're really saying is how you are loved informs the way your important neural networks are shaped, especially those core regulatory networks we talked about earlier.
That's right. There's a lot of complexity to that, but attentive, loving interactions organize and shape the core regulatory networks. This creates a foundation for health that will be built upon as the child grows up. Think of it like building a house. The foundation is put in place first, then the framing, then the flooring and wiring and plumbing, all of it before the house can be occupied. As we've said before, the brain also develops from the bottom up. The lowest networks, those that make up the core regulatory networks, develop first, starting in the womb, and the functions they mediate and modulate show up first during our development. The healthy newborn, for example, can regulate body temperature and basic respiration, but isn't capable of abstract reasoning. Even sleep isn't really well organized yet. Motor movement is uncoordinated. Over time, however, the baby can stand, the toddler will talk, the child will begin to plan, and so forth. The functions related to the middle and then top parts of the brain begin to fully organize. The developmental process is very front-loaded, meaning that the majority of brain growth and organization takes place in the first years of life. Now, this doesn't mean that the brain won't change after early childhood, but early life experiences do have a very powerful impact on how we develop. Let's think about the tree of regulation again. Collectively, the core regulatory networks can reach every part of the developing brain. In fact, the signals the brain receives from the core regulatory networks play a major role in how each of its areas develops. If the core regulatory networks are normally organized and regulated, their signals will result in healthy development of the important higher areas such as the limbic and cortical parts of the brain. But if anything disrupts or alters the core regulatory networks, all of the brain and body systems they influence can be adversely affected. There are 3 types of developmental adversity that will predictably alter the core regulatory networks and cause widespread problems. The first is disruption that happens before birth, such as prenatal exposure to drugs, alcohol, or extreme maternal distress, of the kind that can occur with domestic violence, for example. The second is some form of disruption of the early interactions between infant and caregiver. If these are chaotic, inconsistent, rough, aggressive, or absent, the stress response systems will develop in abnormal ways. The third is any sensitizing pattern of stress. This can result from a host of circumstances, many of which we'll talk about later in more detail. The basic idea is that anything that can cause unpredictable, uncontrollable, or extreme and prolonged activations of the stress response will result in an overactive and overly reactive stress response. I've illustrated this effect in Figure 5.
So, how you were loved is much more complex than simply saying you weren't handled with affection as a child, therefore you'll be sad. What you're really saying is that if you were treated aggressively, or if there was chaotic or neglectful caregiving, or if you weren't held as a child, your brain could be biologically affected.
Exactly. Childhood experiences literally impact the biology of the brain.
And as a result, it will affect how you function for the rest of your life.
It can. Our earliest developmental experiences, particularly touch and other relational-based sensory cues, including the caregiver's smell and the way they rock the infant, the songs they hum when feeding the infant, any unique movement in the way they respond to the infant when it's needy. All of these things are organizing experiences that help create the infant's worldview, the code book we talked about earlier. Again, think of building a house. The fetal brain is developing so rapidly, it's like putting in the foundation of a building. In the first couple of months after you're born, it's like putting up the framing. In the first year, all of your interactions with others are adding the wiring and plumbing. All of these are really important parts of building the house. It's not fully organized yet, but most of the major characteristics of the building are put in place. A 2-year-old child is not yet fully developed, but the foundational structures and systems are there, and these will be the basis for future development. With a house, if you do a bad job with the foundation, put in shoddy wiring and plumbing, but decorate it with beautiful flooring and furniture, the core defects in the house may not be visible as you first walk through, but these early construction issues will lead to problems later on. The same is true with a young child. Really, every aspect of human functioning is influenced by early developmental experiences, both when there are consistent, predictable, and loving interactions, and when there's chaos, threat, unpredictability, or lack of love.
Yes, how were you loved? It makes all the difference in all the conversations I've had. My experience has been that dysfunction shows up in direct proportion to how you were or were not loved. Did you get what you needed to thrive?
Exactly. Love, given and felt, is dependent upon the ability to be present, attentive, attuned, and responsive to another human being. This glue of humanity has been essential to the survival of our species and to the health and happiness of the individual. And this ability is based upon what happened to you, primarily as a young child.
As we're talking about this, I'm thinking back to when I was asked to list my favorite moments from the Oprah show. It wasn't so much the big shows, the surprises or famous guests. It was the quiet conversations, and the Cheerios girl is always one of the first to come to my mind. An 11-year-old named Kate and her older brother Zach joined me on the show a few months after they'd lost their mother, Kathleen, and they told me that prior to her death, their parents decided to spend Kathleen's last months taking trips together as a family. And I asked Kate what her favorite moment from that time had been, and her answer was, for me, a huge aha.
And what are your fondest memories, Kate, of that time?
So, when we went to Palm Springs for family vacation, and she was in bed, but I came home after swimming, and she said, "Can you get me a bowl of Cheerios?" And I said, "Sure." So I remember that.
A bowl of Cheerios.
She ate everything.
Really?
She got up at 2 o'clock in the morning and went downstairs and ate. And about a week before she died, before she went into the hospital, I was in their room and sleeping, and I said, "Mom, would you wake me up if you go downstairs to eat a bowl of cereal?" She said yes. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, we both went down and we ate the cereal together.
That is really Cheerios. Were the Cheerios?
Yeah.
Amazing, amazing.
The family had been everywhere together, but what stayed with Kate was an everyday, intimate moment between a mother and a daughter.
That's a wonderful example of the glue of love. It is in the small moments when we feel the other person fully present, fully engaged, connected, and accepting that we make the most powerful, enduring bonds.
We went back and checked on Kate 20 years after that cereal moment. She let us know that while she's faced painful personal struggles, she still believes strongly in the profound power of connection during life's little yet transcendent moments. These safe, nurturing, and fully present moments that you're talking about.
I love this story because it makes a really important point about these special moments. That the most powerful and enduring human interactions are often very brief. You can spend hours with someone, but if you're not present and attentive, the hours are less powerful than those brief cereal moments.
And when you don't get your cereal moments, if you are a child born in an environment of chaos, confusion, violence, disruption, with no normalcy or regularity, you're being set up to fail because the networks in your brain don't organize in the way they should.
Exactly. That can result in a weaker foundation or miswiring that creates risk for the rest of life. A big part of the vulnerability will come from the way chaotic and unpredictable caregiving influences the developing stress response systems to become sensitized.
Explain how that happens. What does that look like?
Well, let's talk some more about neuroplasticity. Remember, neuroplasticity is basically the changeability of the brain. One of the key principles of neuroplasticity is that the pattern of activation makes a big difference in how a neural network changes. For example, moderate, predictable, and controllable activation of our stress response systems leads to a more flexible, stronger stress response capability that lets a person demonstrate resilience in the face of more extreme stressors. It's kind of like weightlifting for our stress response systems. We exercise the system to make it stronger. The more we face moderate challenges and succeed, the more capable we are of facing bigger challenges. This is something we see in sports, performing arts, clinical practice, firefighting, teaching, almost any human endeavor. Experience can improve performance. This is why stress is not something to be afraid of or avoided. It is the controllability, pattern, and intensity of stress that can cause problems. Unfortunately, for far too many people, the pattern of stress activation is unpredictable, uncontrollable, prolonged, or extreme. Many years ago, I was called to see a child in the hospital, a 13-year-old boy named Jesse. He was in a coma following a head injury that resulted from a fight with his foster father. Jesse was born to a family that had a multi-generational history of sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, involvement in trafficking, and prostituting children. When Jesse was 5, a police investigation found that his parents had been prostituting him. Jesse was removed from his home and placed in foster care. He bounced around the system and, after 3 failed placements, ended up in a foster home that specialized in high-needs children. The foster parents also cared for 9 other children. Many of them had profound developmental problems: delayed language development, explosive and aggressive behaviors, fecal smearing. All had been sent to this home due to uncontrollable behaviors. This family was regarded as having a good track record with difficult children. As it turns out, this family managed the children with terror and abuse. Food was withheld for minor infractions. Physically abusive punishment was routine. Forced exercise was used to exhaust the children. Misbehaving children were forced to sleep outside in a chicken coop. The refrigerator was locked so the children couldn't, quote, steal food. The family's biological teenage children were encouraged to participate in the humiliation and physical abuse of the foster children. Jesse tried to run away from this hell several times. They took away his shoes and clothes at night to try to stop him. He ran anyway, but was always caught and brought back. Once, in winter, running barefoot down a country road in nothing but his underwear, he was picked up by a county deputy sheriff. Jesse told the deputy about the abuse. The deputy told Jesse to stop lying about the good people who had the generosity to bring him into their home. That night, he was forced to sleep in the chicken coop. When he finally got back into the house, his secret diary entry for the day was, "Why does God hate me?" This is an incredibly painful story of suffering, so let's step back from Jesse's experience for a moment and talk about how our stress response systems help us during this kind of ongoing trauma. We've already mentioned the fight-or-flight response. The term was coined in 1915 by the pioneering stress researcher Walter B. Cannon. He used the phrase to describe the acute stress response to a perceived threat and the physiological changes that go along with it. We will call this the arousal response. In the arousal response, as we noted earlier, the brain will focus on the threat, tuning out any non-essential input from the body and the outside world. To prepare for fight or flight, our heart rate increases. Adrenaline and related stress hormones like cortisol are released, as is sugar stored in our muscles. Blood is diverted to our muscles. The general focus of the response is external. Almost everyone has experienced some version of this activating response when feeling threatened, whether the threat is a visit to the dentist, a fender bender, an impending test, a heated argument, or the prospect of public speaking. You may feel your palms sweat, your heart race, you feel anxious or nervous. This is all due to the activation of the arousal response. Of course, if you are typical of most people, you don't go from calm to fight in a few seconds. When we encounter a potential threat, our initial default behavior is to flock.
Wait, please explain flock.
Well, remember that we humans are very social creatures. We are contagious to the emotions of others. We are continually scanning the relational environment for signs of approval and belonging. As you put it, how did I do? So when there is an unexpected, confusing, or potentially threatening signal, we look to others to help determine what's going on. We look to other people, especially to their facial expressions, for emotional clues about how to interpret the situation. Think of the, "Did you just hear that?" or the, "Did he really just say that?" look you and Gail might share when you hear something outrageous or inappropriate. If there is no other person present, or if you get confirmation that this is a threatening situation, you move past flock and scan the environment to put the potential threat in better context. Next, you might freeze. Picture a dark parking lot. You hear a strange noise, so you stop, pause. There's a momentary vapor lock in your thinking. This kind of freeze can also happen when you're in a tense interaction where there are conflicting opinions. You may feel like you're not part of the argument, but then someone asks, "So what's your opinion? What should we do?" Before you're able to process and respond, you may simply stare, frozen. And often your response may not feel very smart. Remember, the more threatened or stressed we are, the less access we have to the smart part of our brain, the cortex. As you feel more threatened, you finally get to a fight or flee state. To put the entire arousal response continuum in a nutshell, think of what happens when you come upon a deer in the woods. Deer are hypervigilant, continually flocking. If they hear something, or if the behavior of another deer changes, they freeze. This helps them localize the potential threat and makes it harder for sight-based predators to see them. If the threat continues, they flee. But if you cornered the deer, it would fight. Flock, freeze, flight, fight. So back to Jesse. During his time in this foster home, his dominant stress response was an arousal response. And he was resisting and running away, fleeing, and ultimately fighting. One of this family's favorite methods for making the children easier to control was to exhaust them. Forced exercise was routine, in particular making them run up and down a flight of stairs. One day, Jesse finally had enough. When he got to the top of the stairs, he refused to keep going. The foster father raged at him, but Jesse would not budge. A fight ensued. Jesse fell, or was thrown, down the stairs. He sustained the serious head injury that led to his coma and hospitalization. As we've discussed, our brain uses a couple of key strategies to help us make sense of the world. First, it makes associations between patterns of sensory input that co-occur, creating memories from our experiences. Second, it uses these stored memories to categorize and interpret new experience. And if new input is similar enough to previous experience, it will categorize the new experience as similar or equal to the past experience. Jesse had two sets of trauma memories. One from his abuse as a very young child, the other from his abuse in the foster home. When he was a small child being abused, a fight-or-flight response, resisting, crying, kicking, trying to fight, would simply not have been adaptive. On the contrary, it would have led to more pain and injury. Fortunately, as we mentioned earlier, our brain has a very different stress response to rely on, the dissociative response. Dissociation is a complex mental capability that we use in everyday life. It involves disengaging from the external world and focusing on our inner world. When we daydream, when we allow our minds to wander, that's a form of dissociation. And like the arousal response, the dissociative response is a continuum. With increasing stress or threat, the dissociative response takes a person deeper and deeper into a protective mode. Whereas the physiology of the arousal response is to optimize fight or flight, the physiology of dissociation is to help us rest, replenish, survive injury, and tolerate pain. Where arousal increases heart rate, dissociation decreases it. Where arousal sends blood to the muscles, dissociation keeps blood in the trunk to minimize blood loss in case of injury. Arousal releases adrenaline. Dissociation releases the body's own painkillers, enkephalins and endorphins. And dissociation was the only adaptive option available to 4-year-old Jesse in abusive moments, the ability to emotionally flee to his inner world. As part of my assessment when Jesse was in a coma, I was able to obtain unwashed clothing from his biological father and foster father. Despite being unconscious, Jesse had a notable physiological response when re-exposed to the scent of these two men. When I placed clothing from the foster father under his nose, he started to thrash and moan, and his heart rate rose from 90 beats per minute to 162. This profound arousal response was, I believe, due to a set of trauma-related memories from his abuse at the hands of his foster father. As with Mr. Roseman from Chapter 1, these memories are stored in lower areas of the brain. When I put clothing from his biological father under his nose, he also reacted with much less movement and his heart rate initially increasing, then plummeting below 60 beats per minute. This was consistent with the dissociative response, elicited by activation of the memory of abuse at the hands of his father. Even when the cortex was unavailable, in other words, asleep or in a coma, these evocative cues triggered complex behaviors, emotions, and physiological responses because they are due to memory stored in lower systems in the brain. The point we're getting at here is that our specific trauma-related responses will depend upon the stress response that was dominant in any given experience. It is possible for one person to have multiple evocative cues that elicit very different behavioral responses. Some trauma-related cues can make you avoidant and shut down. Others can enrage and activate. The complex fingerprint of a traumatic experience will be unique for each person. The timing, nature, pattern, and intensity of a traumatic experience can all influence how a person will be impacted. For Jesse, the story continued. He came out of his coma, but unfortunately suffered residual effects. He ultimately went to a retirement home where he lived and worked as a transportation aide. The process of his recovery has much to tell us about the healing power of connection. When we talk about healing and recovery, we'll revisit Jesse. For now, know that his story shows the remarkable malleability of the brain and the power of hope.
I think that is what people who listen to this audiobook are listening for most, the hope that no matter what happened, there is a sliver of light that might lead them forward. The stories you're sharing are what help people realize that they're not alone in their trauma. With that in mind, can we talk about trauma and fear for a moment? I know so many people who suffered abuse as a child and seem to live in a constant state of fear, despite the threat no longer being there. Can you explain what happens to the brain when you grow up in fear?
A key part of understanding children like Jesse is just that point. They're always in a state of fear. A person will think, learn, feel, and behave differently when they are afraid compared to when they feel safe. All functioning of the brain is state dependent. At any given moment, the collective status of our body's systems and the mind's attention determines the state we're in. And our state can change very quickly. The two biggest categories of state are awake or asleep. In sleep, there are different stages. For instance, REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. The same is true of wakefulness. We have different stages or states of arousal when awake. Figure 6 of the PDF explains these stages. There's a lot of information here, and some of it we won't get to until later in the book, so let me walk you through it. Let's start with the internal state of calm. In this state, we have access to the smartest part of our brain, the cortex. We're relaxed, we let our mind wander and drift. As we move from calm to an active alert state, this is where we focus on some aspect of the external world, a conversation, for example. When we are well regulated, in balance, we are able to stay in the active alert and calm states for most of the day. On occasion, we will be challenged, surprised, or threatened, and we will move to the alarm state. When this happens, we start to think in more emotional ways, as lower systems in the brain begin to dominate our functioning. Our conversations regress into arguments. The logic of our arguments erodes into emotional or personalized attacks. We act less mature. We often say or do things that we regret. If we are truly faced with threat, we will progress to the fear state. Here, even lower parts of our brain dominate our functioning. Our problem-solving skills deteriorate. We focus on the moment. And in the moment, of course, this is adaptive. The problems come when individuals get stuck in this state. This is what a pattern of extreme, prolonged stress can do. Think about Jesse. The unpredictability was continuous. The pain, threat, and fear were uncontrollable and, at times, extreme. His stress response systems adapted and became sensitized. Jesse was stuck in a permanent state of fear. Now, as we've suggested before, what is adaptive for children living in chaotic, violent, and trauma-permeated environments becomes maladaptive in other environments, especially school. The hypervigilance of the alert state is mistaken for ADHD. The resistance and defiance of alarm and fear get labeled as oppositional defiant disorder. Flight behavior gets them suspended from school. Fight behavior gets them charged with assault. The pervasive misunderstanding of trauma-related behavior has a profound effect on our educational, mental health, and juvenile justice systems.
And this is why we need trauma-informed systems and why we need to move away from what's wrong with you to what happened to you.